Thank you all for joining me today in this special lecture. I'm Larry Butler, the lecture coordinator at the EHCC, East Hawaii Cultural Center in lovely Hilo, Hawaii. Usually we do Hawaiian topics or topics related to our own gallery programs. But this week is, as we know, so vexed with the war in Ukraine. And it just happens that that's special knowledge of mine, and I'm eager to share it. I'm delighted you're joining me to do that. I usually introduce other speakers, so I guess I'll just introduce myself. I'm an art historian by training. Medieval and Islamic art are my fields. My specialty within all that is Byzantine art. What's that? That's the art of medieval Eastern Europe, the Slavic countries and Greece. So, hi, my name is Larry. I'm a Byzantinist. Kyiv is a city that I'm familiar with. I studied there. I studied the city. I have visited there. This is really going to be a tale of three cities that I know pretty well. Constantinople, today's Istanbul, where I used to live. Kyiv, of course, and Moscow, which is very much part of the story. And again, it's a city that I know reasonably well and have visited. So to get started, let me put up my PowerPoint and give me a second here to share a screen. Okay, does that look good, I hope? The contested cultural heritage of Kyiv. Oh boy, and it certainly is, isn't it? Right off the bat, let me apologize for being very old. If I slip and say Kiev, it's because that's what it was for most of my life. But like all of us, I'm trying hard to learn to say Kyiv in something like a Ukrainian way. And in fact, I was there in 1991, just at the beginnings of the Ukrainian national movement to separate from the Soviet Union. 1990, that photo on the left there, and by the way, most of my photos are from Wikipedia in public domain. A few of these photos are my crappy photos from 1991. But 1990 was really the first time that the blue and yellow flag, so familiar to us, was raised in a public way, in a public place in front of City Hall. And the Soviet authorities were very alarmed, and blue and yellow became almost something you could get arrested for wearing. It's a modern city, it's a gorgeous city, but as I hope to show you tonight, it's got a very complicated relationship historically with Russia, with Moscow, with Constantinople. So again, it's going to be something of a tale of three cities. I hasten to add that in no way am I condoning any of Mr. Putin's horrendous activities, but I'm hoping that my talk tonight might illuminate a little bit more of his thinking behind his outrageous and violent and criminal invasion of Ukraine. So what was I doing there in 1991? I was attending the International Congress of Byzantine Studies. That was my professional group. We were meeting in Moscow. There was already trouble in August, really all through the summer of 1991. There was serious talk of canceling the conference or moving it to Paris, but we went ahead. We met in Moscow, and that's another whole talk. After the conference, I joined the tour, and a bunch of us old Byzantinists went zipping off to what was then Leningrad, St. Petersburg, of course. And as we're leaving St. Petersburg for Kyiv, our guide says, "Comrade Gorbachev is ill." What? What does that mean? I don't know. It's on the radio. Everything stopped. They're playing patriotic music. Get on the plane quick. We're going to Kyiv. We're going now. So we did, and we had a very strange tour of Kyiv as the Gorbachev coup was unfolding. You know, there's the St. Sophia Church, and Gorbachev is still alive. And that was how it went for about 5 days. It was very strange. So as you can imagine, the events that we're seeing today ring a lot of bells for me, and that's really why I want to present this talk. It involves my own expertise, involves my own experience, as well as, of course, all of our concerns about what's going on now. Oh, that picture on the right, by the way, I really did once have dark hair. No one believes me. The actual dissolution of the Soviet Union came very, very quickly after the events of August. By late August, the Ukrainian government was declaring independence from Soviet Union, and by December, there is Boris Yeltsin, third from the right, signing the papers, along with dignitaries from the other Soviet, now ex-Soviet states. You can see the Ukrainian flag there on the left. This is a very exciting time. So what's at stake? Some of the most spectacular medieval buildings in Europe, some of the most important cultural sites for the Slavic world and for the Orthodox Christian world, and of course, the heritage of Ukraine and Russia as well. For instance, the Cathedral of St. Sophia. Arguably, you can consider it the mother church of Russian Orthodoxy. Russian Orthodoxy? Well, yes, this was in fact the first capital of ancient Russia. We call it Kievan Rus. It's gone, it's long gone. The Russians moved off to Moscow long since, but this is one of the monuments they left behind. Another one, the Pchersk Lavra, or Monastery of the Caves, begun about the same time, is one of the absolute central theological fountainheads of Orthodox Christian thought. Any number of Orthodox Christian saints have been associated with the monastery all through its history, right up until very recently. The caves are a bunch of things that run under the hillside, and spectacular buildings have been built as part of a monastery on the site ever since. And it just so happens that these two complexes were in fact Ukraine's first listing on the World Heritage Site. So UNESCO's World Heritage recognizes the St. Sophia Cathedral and the Pchersk Monastery as absolutely crucial amongst the, what is it now, about 1,700, I think, monuments throughout the world considered absolutely crucial to the history of human culture. There's a lot at stake now, and every time I read about troops marching towards Kyiv, or we hope broken down outside of Kyiv, this is what I worry about, because I'm an architectural historian. What can I say? Let's say this is going to be a tale of three cities, really. Constantinople, today's Istanbul, was the center of the Byzantine Empire, the great power, when Kyiv and Rus were first started up in the 9th and 10th centuries. I'm also going to take you to Moscow, the third Rome, and explain how it got that sobriquet and how that fits into the story with Kyiv in the middle of these other two cities. Oh, let me be a teacher for a minute. What is Byzantium? I keep using the term. Byzantium is a modern term for the East Roman Empire, whose capital was not Rome at all, but the capital was built as Constantinople, today's Istanbul. You see it's way to the east, and it controls the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, the whole Eastern Mediterranean, and all of the river systems that come through Eastern Europe. The Danube, the Danube, the Dnieper, the Volga, all of the great rivers. Probably the most famous structure from ancient Byzantium is the Hagia Sophia Cathedral. You notice it has minarets now. It's spent about 1,000 years as the main cathedral of Orthodox Christianity. And then it spent another 500 years as the main mosque of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And it's as a mosque, it grew those minarets. Fine, it's in perfect shape. It's in spectacular shape for a 1,500-year-old building. We should all look so good. The name, you notice, Saint Sophia, is not really a saint. It's not some lady named Sophia. Sophia means wisdom in Greek. This is the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which in a rather circular way is one of the names of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ in the Trinity, the Christians have a three-part God, One part is Jesus Christ, who represents the human side of God and the human wisdom of God. That's what Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, means. It's a church to the holy wisdom of God, and that is Jesus Christ. Byzantium was involved with the Slavs very early. You can see that these very Slavic groups and other groups coming from even farther east clustered all around what's now Central and Eastern Europe. Lots and lots of names, and I won't bore you with them, but let's say that in Byzantium, a lot of the early diplomacy was trying to keep all those Slavs in their place, keep them in Bulgaria, keep them on the rivers, keep them out of our hair as they became increasingly bold, migrating from Central Asia into Europe. First, it was military confrontations, and then one by one, it was commercial relations. And what Byzantium was very good at was conversions. If you can't beat them, join them, right? So they started sending out missionaries to convert the various Slavic and other immigrant peoples coming through to Orthodox Christianity. Of course, the Pope is trying to do the same thing with Roman Catholic Christianity. And by the 11th century, the two had in fact completely split, the two churches. The Slavs were first converted in the 9th century when St. Cyril and Methodius, who were two brothers from Thessaloniki, were invited into Moravia, in what's now the Czech Republic, to bring them religion, bring them Orthodox religion, which was at that time the same religion as Catholicism, actually. They hadn't split yet. Rather than trying to force Latin down their throats, which the popes were doing, they rewrote all of the Gospels in a language that didn't even have an alphabet yet. But the two brothers developed the alphabet, what we now call the Cyrillic alphabet after Cyril, and in fact standardized what we call Old Church Slavonic, which is an archaic form of Slavonic language that is still used in very, very deep ritual associations today. Let's bring in another bunch, not the Slavs at all, but the Vikings. What? Vikings? Really? Yes, really. The Varangians, to give them their Byzantine term, people still argue about their origins, but I think at this point, most people agree that Scandinavians, and primarily what we would call Swedes today, were using the Russian rivers for trade between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, using all of those little Russian rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper, et cetera, trading as far as Baghdad by one route and increasingly trading with Byzantine Constantinople. You might know this bunch if you've ever seen that wonderful movie, The 13th Warrior, which is based on a real character, Ibn Fadlan, who was an Islamic ambassador to the Northlands. Now go figure out what's going on up there. Up he went, up the Volga, and gives us our only description of a Viking funeral. If you've seen the movie, I don't need to explain the blood and the gore. It's all great fun in storytelling terms, but it's also real history. The Varangians or Norse were in fact controlling the trade on those rivers. And they pop up in Constantinople as the Viking Guard, and you can see them here. There's the Emperor Theodosius enthroned in the center, and flanking him were a bunch of scary-looking guys with spears. Those are his Scandinavian guards. They're great because they were big and tall and blonde, which nobody else in Constantinople was, and they didn't speak Greek. So, you know, they were kind of their own little closed society. And again, the military eventually grows into trade relations, and they start trading regularly with Constantinople from places like Novgorod at the north end of what are now the Russian river routes, very close to the Baltic and Scandinavia. And today, Novgorod, like so much in Russia, it was horribly destroyed in World War II by the German invasion and has been spectacularly rebuilt. And it really feels medieval. Gives a good sense of what these medieval trading cities, including Kyiv, looked like back in the 9th and 10th centuries, with walls, with rivers, and with great Russian-style cathedrals with domes. Oh dear, so where does Kyiv come from? At one point in 860, these Varangians decided to simply attack Constantinople. I mean, why bother to trade when you can maybe attack and pillage? And came darn close to conquering the city. The Byzantines didn't know what had hit them. It happened 2 more times in the next 50 years. And eventually the Varangian, or call them Vikings, call them Norse, increasingly take on the name Rus. We're not really sure the origin of that. And they signed treaties with Byzantium. And that is how Kyiv really gets established. It is a wonderful site for trade. It's at the center of several major trade routes along the main river and also side routes going east to west. So east, west, north, south. This became the great center for the Varangians, for the Rus, for the Norse. They're all the same people. And they built a permanent trading site here. Even today, the city is really beautiful. It's quite hilly and quite wooded. It's, I think, the most wooded city I've ever been in Europe, and dominated still today by the lovely towers of the great monasteries. Now, it's a bit more built up now. I took that picture in 1991. And it still commemorates all of this. Rhetoric is the ruler who comes down from Novgorod and sets up shop in Kyiv with the encouragement, with the blessing of the Byzantines, and starts really the formal first Russian state that we call Kievan Rus. That little apostrophe there after the RUS, it's always in there. It reflects a letter in Russian. And here's a monument down by the river showing him and his 2 brothers showing up at a Viking ship and parking the ship there in the public park in Kyiv. Bits and pieces of the city they founded can be imagined through some of the monuments, some of them very, very ancient, and some of them rebuilt. That's okay too. We know a lot of what the Great Gate, the Golden Gate of Kyiv looked like in the 10th century. It looks something like this. They've reconstructed it there on the left. You can visit it, get a sense of the scale of the place, even in the 10th and 11th centuries, especially the 11th, it got all built up. There's actually a little chapel on the very top of the gate. As is traditional, it's a chapel to St. Michael, who was the archistrategos, the commander-in-chief of the forces of heaven in Orthodox Christian thinking. And many, many places, not just in Eastern Europe, but also, say, Mont Saint-Michel in France. High places are often associated with St. Michael and his struggle with the devil. The Kievan Rus state was never very centralized. It was run out of Kyiv and spread through a series of semi-independent principates, mostly north and somewhat east, Moscow being one of them on the northeast fringes of it. But you can see its position between the Scandinavia and the Black Sea made it very, very wealthy. So they get more and more involved with Constantinople. I love this old Prince Valiant cartoon. To me, it kind of sums up the essence of medieval Constantinople and the allure for the foreigners. Yuan Chen's trireme glides into Constantinople at dawn. The capital of the Eastern Empire is a golden city with all the wealth and splendor that the Western world has lost. And the Emperor Justinian rules half the lands that border the Mediterranean, the inland sea. This is what kept by the 11th century, really, both Kyiv and Constantinople were each other's greatest trading partners, and that went on. We have more and more Rus types coming down from Kyiv and looking at the Hagia Sophia, the great church, and marveling over it. There is a wonderful story that one day, Saint Vladimir, or Volodymyr, decided that the Rus needed a religion. They were tired of being barbarians. So the story is he sent out embassies from his court all over Europe and the Near East to try to find out what religion they should join. Well, they all came back and reported, well, Islam is all very well, but you can't drink wine and you can't eat pork. Oh, forget that. Next. German folks came back and said, well, we went to Germany and we looked at the Roman church there, and it just really wasn't very good. It was kind of small and kind of dirty, and we weren't very impressed. Next, another embassy went and talked to the Jews and said, well, they're very interesting, but they couldn't hold their own country. What good are they going to do for us? Next. And then the embassy that had gone down to Constantinople reported back. The Orthodox Church, they said, my God, we were taken to the Hagia Sophia. We were treated to a service, and we did not know, says the Russian Primary Chronicle, we did not know whether we were on heaven or on earth. Of course, it helps that Byzantium was Kyiv's greatest trading partner, but they in fact did embrace Orthodoxy and still very much do. We have all sorts of wonderful stories about the baptism of the king himself and his two sons. That's what's in the icon on the right. And there's all sorts of modern paintings of various tackiness showing people either in the river or in the baptismal fount. But the effect is the same. So from about the year 1000 on, Kievan Rus and Kyiv itself are entirely Orthodox Christian. What are some of the monuments? Let's get back to my monuments. The very first church that was built, it's destroyed now. It just sort of fell apart and got bulldozed after a while. But the Soviets did a lot of archaeology on it. We now have the plan, we have fragments. You go to the park, you can peer through little glass windows and see the fragments. This is the Desetina, or the tithe church, because the ruler promised 1/10 of all of his annual salary or whatever he had to building this. Now, okay, it doesn't look very impressive in plan, but bear in mind, this was the absolutely very first church built of masonry. Really, any monument to building built of masonry in what was then Russia. They actually had to teach the locals how to make bricks. They did not know. They found that, Kyiv in winter is no place to be making bricks. It's a place to be hiding in your house with a fire going. They brought up mosaics and mosaic workers from Constantinople. They brought up floor tiles. You see floor tiles down there on the right. So it's a huge thing that the conversion of Kyiv to Orthodox Christianity also meant the onslaught of first world technology of the time. It was just an enormous cultural change. The oldest church still standing is the most magnificent one in Kyiv, and the one that we all worry the most about. This is the great St. Sophia Church. Again, it's not named after a lady named Sophia. It's named after the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. It doesn't really resemble it. Right from the outset, the architects of Kyiv and Rus favored lots and lots of little domes and very large, complicated plans. You can see it right there. What you see today is mostly an 18th century Ukrainian Baroque exterior. But if you see some little panels of brick right there and there, this is where the archaeologists have uncovered the plaster and show you the original brick construction from the 11th century. The inside is magnificent and utterly irreplaceable. It's the first great mosaic, Byzantine mosaic program we have in the Russian realm. It shows Jesus Christ in the center of the main dome, and in the apse over the altar, there's the Virgin Mary. Those are original Byzantine mosaics of very high quality. And the rest of the church is some mosaics, but mostly fresco paintings on the wall. This was the royal church. Today, by the way, it is a monument. It's UNESCO World Heritage, as I noted at the beginning. And for various complicated reasons, only one of which is archaeology, the church is now a museum. It's not used normally for services. They do have them occasionally, they're not opposed, but they don't want the heavy kind of usage and candles and all that that comes with a regular church service. So now it's a museum. Here's how it might have looked originally. As I say, very, very complicated and lots of domes. The plan there, the central part in orange, that's the original building. Already it was 5 aisles, it was transepts, it was 5 chapels at the east end, it was the whole works, and then they made it bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, 18th century, it got the plaster cover and those Baroque domes. It's all still there. It's in surprisingly good condition, considering Kyiv's very violent history. Some of the frescoes inside continue that connection between Kyiv and Constantinople. For instance, this is the only depiction we have in fresco of the great hippodrome by the palace, not in Kyiv, but in Constantinople. So clearly the rulers who built the church and decorated the church were trying to continue by association the imperial connection to Constantinople and their own court in Kyiv. Another of the very earliest complexes was the Monastery of the Caves. Again, this is part of the UNESCO World Heritage listing for Kyiv. It's a lot of buildings. It isn't just one. It's the caves themselves. It's a great cathedral. It's lots of side churches. It's a refectory, library, dormitory, the works. It's had its ups and downs, and I'll get into that. But it is, again, not just aesthetically important. It's also intellectually, historically, religiously, fundamentally important, both to the history of Ukraine and, of course, to the history of Russia. What are these caves? Well, it's a hilly city, and they're dug all over the place in the hills along the river. There's I didn't mean new caves, I mean near caves and far caves, and tunneled all through with buildings built on top, you can see in this drawing. On the right there is the refectory or dining hall. It's been much rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt, like so many things in Eastern Europe. If you've been to Germany or to China, you remember that they all have glorious histories of architecture. And most of it's been destroyed in one invasion or another and rebuilt. The Germans, the Chinese, and the Soviets were all very, very eager, and now the Ukrainians too, very eager to reproduce monuments that got blown up. And sure enough, here's my picture from 1991. The refectory was still there. That's that round dome, low round dome. And on the right, you see ruins. Well, that is the wonderful Dormition Cathedral. And when I was there in 91, they said, oh, it blew up. No one's really sure who, actually. It was during World War II. And of course, the Soviets said the Germans did it. The Germans said the Soviets did it. And there's a little bit of truth plausibly on both sides there, so I'm not going to judge. But it's a reminder that Kyiv has been built and destroyed many times. And sure enough, there it is today. Look at that with the gilded domes. It was entirely rebuilt. The church itself, the Dormition church itself, was built on its ruins in the 1990s as an early expression of Ukrainian nationalism. It is spectacular. And note the statue right in the middle of the picture is a gigantic titanium awful statue that was put up in the Brezhnev era. It represents the motherland. And of course, no one's quite sure which motherland it represents at this point. It's a figure of a woman, and she's holding a sword and a shield, and on the shield is an emblem of the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. It was, of course, meant to encourage patriotism to the Soviet Union. I'm not sure the Ukrainians ever thought very much of that. They certainly didn't when I was there. It's funny, ever since there's been discussions, well, should we remove the Soviet symbol? And they just haven't gotten around to it. I think at this point, it's just kind of become a symbol, and there it is, and oh well. But it's yet another indication of the vexed shared heritage of Kyiv between the Ukrainians and the Russians. What happened to Kiev and Rus, the first Russian state and the first capital, Kyiv, they were simply wiped off the map by the Tartar Mongol invasions in the 13th century. The Tatar Mongols came roaring across and famously put all of the various Russian principalities under what's known as the Tatar yoke for about 100 years, destroyed city after city after city. I've never quite known how the St. Sophia in Kyiv survived all that. Apparently it did, but the city walls were destroyed. And this is really when Russia, as we think of it today, moved north. And Kievans, whoever they are, begin to migrate in. What happens is the main center of gravity of Russia simply moves north to the Principate of Moscow, which is much farther north. It's in the forests. It's harder for Tartars to invade on horseback and kind of set up shop in their new capital up in Moscow and Vladimir and thereabouts. So that is the kind of proto-history of the Russian state. It simply moved, and Kyiv was still there, basically nothing for 100 years. And then it's such an important location, it was built up again. So all of this is a long way of pointing out the Byzantine Orthodox origins of Russian architecture. And these are, of course, shared with today's Ukraine. And again, you can, without apologizing for Mr. Putin's actions, you can sort of see why the Ukraine drives him mad. Apparently it's been driving him crazy for years. It's ours, we made it, he says. Well, yeah, but then they bugged out in the 13th century, and that was that. But still, the impact is tremendous. All across what's now Russia are early cathedrals like this one in Vladimir near Moscow, which are based on the experience of Kyiv and Kievan Rus. This particular cathedral is interesting. It once held the icon there on the left, the Virgin of Vladimir, which is one of the 2 or 3 most famous icons now in Russia. It was sent as a gift from the Emperor of Byzantium to the new Russian state up in the north, and has been absolutely revered in Russia ever since as not just a masterpiece of painting, but also as a miraculous icon. There's lots and lots of copies of it. Here are a couple. And in fact, it ended up when the Kremlin was built in the great cathedral of Dormition at the heart of the Kremlin, the Virgin of Vladimir was put right up there in front of the altar. What's there now is a copy, I'm afraid. The original is in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow because it's so fragile, it's kept as a work of art. But the Orthodox Church in Russia is forever begging to have the original back. And for all I know, it may be back by now. I haven't kept up to date. What am I getting at here? What I'm getting at here is the deep, deep traditions of art and architecture coming out of Kyiv, medieval Kyiv, and deeply informing what's now the Russian state. We can get some sense of those great monasteries, maybe by visiting the monastery of Trinity in St. Sergei, just north of Moscow, about 50 miles, spectacularly restored. Even in 1991, it had been, I think it was the only place in the Soviet Union that was allowed to train priests and keep monks all the way through the Soviet period. And it's one of the most exciting places in Russia to get a sense, really, of old Russia and the strength of the church and its artistic, architectural, and liturgical ornaments. There's another actor here in our story, and that would be the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, who came in and finally knocked out Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, what was left of it, in 1453. It's a long story, it's a different lecture, but let's just say the end of Byzantium was a snuff attack from all sides by the Ottoman Turks, and you can see lots of that if you go to Istanbul today. There's the Rumeli Hisar Fortress. I used to live right above it, and there is one of their cannons that they were the pioneers of that actually managed to clear the Bosphorus Straits of ships. And oh my goodness, is that my husband Frank by that cannon? Shame on him. Down came the walls, down came Byzantium, down came the fountainhead of Orthodox Christianity. And to this day, all over Eastern Europe, you can hear the songs, you can see the paintings. It's still a tragedy in the folk memory of Greece, of Romania, of Bulgaria, of Ukraine, and of Russia itself. This is a fresco from a Romanian monastery showing the fall of Constantinople. By the way, the Ottoman Sultan, really interesting figure, kind of a Renaissance man of his own, died just as he's preparing to invade Italy. Oh, well. But one thing the Ottomans did, by the way, and the Turks are still doing today, is taking magnificent care of the old Hagia Sophia, the Saint Sophia. So no worries for this one. Here it is in the 17th century. They're still working on it today. And yes, I know it was recently reconverted to mosque use. That's fine with me. The Turks have been superb custodians of the 15-year-old building. There are still some of the late icons from Constantinople floating around, not many. Most were destroyed in the conquest. But if you look at these, you can see that they're not quite Russian. Russian ones are more elongated. These are more naturalistic. The faces are broader. It reminds us that Russia went off on its own tangent, artistically speaking, and developed its own style. So how does this fit into our story? This is when Moscow becomes, in effect, the third Rome. As they like to see it, ancient Rome was the first Rome, and then the Roman Empire moved east to Constantinople, and with the fall of Constantinople, the third Rome is Moscow. Oh my. In fact, the Tsars took on their title, Tsar. Tsar means emperor. It's derived from the Latin Caesar. They took their title shortly after the fall of Constantinople. They announced, okay, we are now the emperors of Orthodox Christianity. It happened that the ruler at the time was married into the Byzantine royal family, and so he had really plenty of reason to proclaim himself the new emperor of the Orthodox. The Kremlin, in fact, is modeled surprisingly on the Great Palace of Constantinople, which has now entirely disappeared. It's under restaurants and hotels now. But the idea of an inner walled fortress palace filled with not just government buildings, but armories and cathedrals. This all was part of the idea of Moscow as the third Rome. So the cathedrals here, some of them actually built by Italian architects, continue that glorious style that we first saw in Kyiv, with the domes and the towers and the complex plans. Maybe the ultimate of the Russian complexity, it would be in St. Basil's Cathedral there at the end of Red Square, that wonderful iconic building where Byzantine forms are stretched and lengthened to their ultimate and then painted bright, bright colors. Oh, you have to love that building. I'm sorry to tell you, originally it was painted white. I'm not sure when they got the bright idea to color it, but aren't we so glad that they did? So this is an extreme example of starting with the Hagia Sophia in Russia, in Constantinople, but this is the evolution of Russian style. So there we are. In fact, this is an old picture of mine, and if I took it today, you would see yet another gigantic Russian cathedral built in the mid-grounds there. It was the Savior Cathedral. It was torn down by the Soviets. It was built in the 19th century, torn down by the Soviets, turned into a civic swimming pool. And it was one of the very first things that Boris Yeltsin did upon becoming president, to say, we're going to build that church back up again. And so the Russians rebuilt a fairly accurate model of what had been destroyed. Have we heard this story before? Oh, how did Kyiv fare during the Soviet period? Well, it's interesting. For a long time, for centuries, it didn't really belong to any major polity. After the Tatars, all of the Russian states kind of disintegrated, went off wandering their own ways. It was variously held by Poland and Lithuania Poland, Yeah, that was another one. Taken over by the Cossacks from the south and run for about a century. It was in the 17th and 18th centuries that the Russians regained control of Ukraine. So there's a long interim between the 13th century and the 18th century when this is not really ruled by Russia or out of Moscow at all. Anyway, 1917, for about 10 minutes, there was an independent Ukraine, and instantly that was taken over by the Soviets and pushed into the great Soviet Confederation. It was a major industrial city, and you can still see that today, lots and lots of factories, shipbuilding, textiles, all sorts of good stuff, as well as being a major food producer. Ukraine, of course, is still one of the great food producers of all of Europe. Russians took interest in the place. It wasn't always terribly important, but Empress Elizabeth quite liked it and had herself built a summer palace here. And since she was living there in the summer, she needed a church. And so one of the glories of Kyiv, one of the monuments that we're all gritting our teeth over right now, is this gorgeous 18th century classical church. Interesting, you can tell it's Ukrainian Baroque style with those complicated green onion domes, so typical of Ukraine and really of nowhere else. But it's also, the detailing is neoclassical. It was in fact designed by the Italian court architect Rastrelli, who in part built the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg and a number of other important buildings for the Tsars of Russia. So it's this wonderful conglomeration of neoclassicism, late Russian Baroque, and toss in the icons. Another of the great churches of Kyiv that the Russians inherited, the Russians inherited and then the Soviets, the Cathedral of St. Michael of the Golden Domes. Isn't that a nice name? And yes, it was. This again is one of the very, very oldest churches in Kyiv, built originally in the 11th century. Unfortunately, it was in the way of Soviet urban renewal plans. Really? Really? The Soviets were quite unsentimental about knocking down major churches. We saw they knocked down one in Moscow, they knocked down a bunch in St. Petersburg. This one got leveled. Whoops, there it is in 1937. Too bad. They actually managed to strong-arm the local Ukrainian Academy of Arts to sign letters proclaiming that really it wasn't that old building at all. No. It all been rebuilt in the 18th century. No loss there, which is complete nonsense. But you know, if the Soviets are telling you what to sign, you sign what they tell you to sign. And so there it is. They demolished it. They were going to put a big new government building on it. That never happened either. When I was there in 1991, it was just this big aching field in the middle of Kyiv. And its treasures were distributed. Very strange. Before they knocked the building down, they called in the art historians, people like me, say, well, what should we save? And you can imagine the poor art historians tearing their hair out and crying. And they managed to save some of the great mosaics from the 11th and 12th centuries. Did they keep them in Kyiv? Oh no, that would be modern practice. Modern practice is you keep stuff near original locations. No. They sent some off to the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad. They sent some to Moscow. They sent some to the St. Sophia Cathedral, which you see in the picture there on the right. They set up a little museum upstairs to the departed Church of St. Michael's. Okay, so that's one way to handle ruined building, I guess. Meanwhile, once again, as soon as Ukraine was independent in 1991, they pursued plans to rebuild the whole darn thing, and there it is. So you're seeing a pattern here of great churches being destroyed and then rebuilt when the regime changes and it becomes convenient to have them back again. It's part of the history of the region, and it makes us all crazy. But I say, the Germans do it, the Chinese do it by necessity. And so did the Soviets, so do the Russians, so do the Ukrainians. So this is now the headquarters of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And this is yet another story of vexed shared heritage. There are two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, centered in Kyiv. One has the metropolitan, or the patriarch, if you will. One, the patriarch is in Moscow. And Kyiv, Ukraine are a subset. That's the old established one. Just a few years ago, the Ukrainians set up a rival Orthodox church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is headquartered here. Oh man, here's the Russian one, seat of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. It's 1895 building. Again, it's had a rough life. I think when the Nazis occupied the city, this is one of the ones they used for stabling horses or some such story like that. So anyway, these are two competing patriarchates, both claiming to be the one Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Oh dear. Interestingly, the Moscow Patriarchate-based Ukrainian Church is heavily supported by, guess who? President Putin. He is a huge patron of the Russian Orthodox Church. He stubbornly insists that the Ukrainian Church is a subset of the Russian Church. It plays into his thinking clearly as he invades Ukraine and declares it was his all along. Here he is being sworn in for his second term as president in the Kremlin in front of the Dormition Church. And in so many ways, he is taking on the trappings of the Tsar of the Russian Empire with the enthusiastic support of the Russian Church. We'll see if that lasts through the current war or not. Even I'm told the Russian Orthodox Church is getting nervous about this war. I don't know if they told him that. So, oh dear, here we are. Back to the Constantinople connection. It was in fact the head of the Orthodox Church worldwide, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Yes, there still is one. He's in a little church down on the Golden Horn. He's the one that blessed the separation of Ukrainian church from the Moscow church and gave a pat on the back to the new Patriarch of Ukraine, based in Kyiv. And here he is being greeted by the Jewish president of Ukraine, Zelensky, just last year when he came to visit Kyiv and proclaimed the split. A good thing infuriated Moscow, infuriated Putin. Putin apparently considered at one point assassinating him, was talked out of that. That's nice. So this tale of three cities is still evolving, involving the shared and really vexed heritage between Constantinople, Kyiv, and Moscow. Let me add a footnote to all this, I think a very interesting one, not so much involved with ancient monuments, is the Jewish population of Kyiv. It always had some, being a trading center and the Jews always being active on the East European trade routes, there was always a presence. It really became large in the 19th century when Kyiv was transformed into a manufacturing center. And they came in with the textile trade and the food processing trade and the transport trade and all those other good 19th century things were quite prosperous. There were, probably some 20, 30,000 in the mid 1890s. They built two great synagogues, both of which have been restored. Again, the Nazis parked their horses in them, but that was then. The Great Choral Synagogue is, excuse me, is the major synagogue now in Kyiv, and there's another one across the way. Oops, sorry. The Nazi occupation was, of course, horrible for everyone, horrible. It didn't help that Kyiv was on the front lines and the Soviets were all too happy to do scorched earth defense by blowing things up, which is why they're still arguing over whether it was the Soviets or the Nazis that blew up the Dormition Cathedral. Oh, who knows? But the city was once again, not for the first time, I hope for the last time, was wiped out by warfare. The Jewish population, well, you can imagine what happened to them. Some 120,000 people of all sorts were executed here at the Baba Yar or Baba Yar site. It's a valley. It's a gully just outside of Kyiv proper. It's within the city, I think, actually. In 1941, the order came to round up all the Jews and kill them, murder them. And sure enough, in 1941, in one day alone, 34,000 Ukrainian Jews were rounded up here, told they're going to be deported and shot by firing squads. One day, 34,000. Ultimately, they think about 120,000 people, probably around 100,000 of whom were Jewish, were executed over the next 2 years. Executed, nothing, were murdered here at Baba Yar. How does this fit into my story? Well, besides being something that needs to be said, you might have caught in the news last week that the Russian invasion force fired a rocket at the Kyiv television station and managed to hit the Baba Yar monuments and kill 5 people. I don't believe it was intentional. I just think it was a bad shot, but it stirred up so much misery. It's one of the world's sacred tragedy spots. Back in the 1970s, the great Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, and yes, that's a Ukrainian name, of course, but he wrote in Russian as a Russian, wrote a famous poem called Baba Yar. Nad Baba Yarom pamyatnikov net. Above Baba Yar, there is no monument. And as late as the 1970s, that was true. The Jewish Holocaust was a taboo topic in the Soviet Union. It just went crosswise to all of the official propaganda about the Soviets and Jews and all that. Soviets were never very good for Jews. After that poem was published, the composer Shostakovich wrote his 13th symphony dedicated to Baba Yar, and between those two things really forced the Soviets to take note of Baba Yar, and the monuments started going up. These are my photos from 1991. It had been turned into a park, this awful statue of a family in the right hand there. And the monument has plaques in Hebrew as well as Russian. I don't remember it was in Ukrainian. Ukrainian language you just didn't see much of in 1991. Anyway, there's been a Jewish revival since World War II. Again, there's a significant population. The synagogues are back in use again. It's fascinating to a lot of us that the president of Ukraine is in fact Jewish, from an old Ukrainian Jewish family. And sure enough, he had relatives who were massacred at Baba Yar. And there he is presenting remembrance for all of that. What am I getting at here? Let me wrap it up. No one likes war. Everyone's horrified by Putin's invasions. For me, as a medieval architectural historian and a scholar of Eastern Europe, this really hurts me on all sorts of levels. As a person, as a scholar, as an architect, will the World Heritage designation save the great monuments from Russian artillery fire? Well, we just don't know. We all have our fingers crossed, our teeth clenched. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. And thank you so much for letting me vent about the vexed shared cultural heritage of Kyiv in this time when it is so terribly, terribly endangered. Thank you for your attention. And I'll be very happy to have you unmute and do questions. And let's see if I can get back to my screen. There I am. You didn't see me cry, right? Good. Are there any questions or comments?
I got a quick one.
Cynthia, what's on your mind?
Isn't it really in Putin's interest to keep those monuments if they're so important, culturally?
I think absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I imagine he's tearing his hair over it. Apparently he thought he was going to do a blitzkrieg and just go roaring in with this 40-mile column that is now stalled for whatever reason and simply take Kyiv. And clearly that's not happening. So His plan B, such as it is, seems to be to increasingly bomb civilian sites, which is a war crime through numbers of treaties. By the way, targeting cultural monuments is also the subject of a specific 1950s convention on war crime. It's a no-no to target these. I am sure he does not want them destroyed. I think you're absolutely right. But whether or not that's going to happen, nobody knows. You know, who knows what the next couple of weeks are going to bring? I don't know. Other comments? Yes, sir. Zoom user.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm called a Zoom user. I used to have a name, you know, but this stuff is ahead of me. My name is Tomas Belsky. My father was born in Belarus, so I have a little bit of knowledge, not firsthand knowledge. I was born in the States, you know. I'm very Americanized, but I first I want to thank you for your presentation. I found it very informative and I much appreciated. You know,
thank you.
I see this vein of a theocratic mentality running through this whole program. You know, not yours. I mean, but there seems to be this constant bickering between the Orthodox Church on one and the other. I was baptized Greek Orthodox because there was no Russian Orthodox in our town. But the thing is, I recall the Orthodox churches fighting with each other. You know, one is claiming they're the real one, and the other says these are imposters. And I remember going to a Russian Orthodox church in New Jersey, and it was horrifying to me that I was a kid, and I had to hear this priest. I don't know if they call him priest or Monsignor or something, and he was raging that this is the real Easter. The other Easter was a couple of weeks off or something, and
different calendars.
Are they still fighting this nonsense? I read this. I mean, to me, it's nonsense. I have absolutely no sympathy for it at all.
Yeah, well, I'll beg off from the nonsense label, but they're absolutely still fighting. As I mentioned, as recently as last year, the two churches split, and yes, it's been going on for a long time. The head of the Orthodox Church worldwide is the Patriarch of Constantinople, and everybody's happy with that, but he's not a pope. He's not the ruler of the church. He's the first among equals. And so when he went against the Moscow Patriarch and said, yes, Ukraine is now an independent patriarchate, it came under terrible, terrible pressure. And that's going to go on and on. But yeah, it's been that way for a long time. Oh dear. A lot of that's just tension between new national states and older empires. Things that were all once the Ottoman Empire are now 20 different countries. Things that were once all the Russian Empire are lots of different countries. And so it's the political and the historic is deeply interlocked with the religious. And as you say, there's a lot of theocracy involved. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Susie.
Hi. I found your lecture extremely interesting, and I really love history, and I've not really delved too much into this particular part of the world. And what I was wondering is that when the Rus first appeared, were they actually the people of the area, or where were they from, or who were they?
That's a wonderful question, and there have been lots and lots of books written trying to figure that out. What we think, the current thinking, and it could change, but through the archaeology, through the old chronicles, and there aren't very many, there's very little written evidence. We think that the Rus were Scandinavians, including Vikings, who used the rivers for trade and took over the locals. And in fact, there's a story that at one point the locals kicked the Rus out of Novgorod, tried to run it themselves for a few years and realized that, oh, we don't have any laws and we've never done a government, and actually invited the Rus back in to govern them. So it seems to be a small aristocracy of Scandinavians who ruled over lots and lots of different local tribes and eventually amalgamated. The Rus adopted Slavic language, which hadn't been original, and the others followed the government.
Well, that
We
kind
think
of
that's the
falls in-
story.
That kind of falls in line with the Vikings, who were quite treacherous and, you know,
Mhm.
very domineering. And
Mhm.
what I was wondering is, as far as ancestry is concerned, in Russia, are there more of the Viking lineage?
Uh-huh. Yes, absolutely. They find all sorts of Viking stuff. Archaeology is pretty clear that the Vikings were all, or the Norse, the Rus, whatever they were, that they were all up and down the rivers. The river system into the Black Sea, but also even farther east, the river system ultimately to Baghdad and the Islamic Caliphate.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
lots
then
of
they were
archaeology.
actually Scandinavians then.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, who's next? Who's brave?
I'll ask a question unless somebody else wants to.
Carol, please.
Yes, yeah, I care about words and I'm ignorant about the whole thing. I think I grew up thinking of it as Kiev and now it's Kyiv. And,
Mhm.
you know, we accept changes to what's acceptable. I mean, you know, in 1960, Negro was acceptable. And now we know a lot better than that because we need to keep up with the times. I don't know anything about the changes in the way Kyiv is or Kiev is spelled or pronounced, but I would love to get a little to be schooled on that.
Okay, there's a very good way. I didn't put it in my PowerPoint, but the Washington Post has a little sidebar this week on Kyiv or Kiev. And it's a video with audio and somebody explains the different spellings and the different pronunciations. The basic thing is, yeah, it's like Peking and Beijing, Mumbai, Bombay, Madras, Chennai, all those places. Yeah, the name is changed and there seems to be a consensus. Largely, I think, out of sympathy with the war. There's a consensus to use the Ukrainian pronunciation, which, by the way, I can't reproduce. Those vowels, it includes vowels we don't have in American English. But Kyiv is as close as we can do. I think Kyiv is closer, but I'm not going to try that. I mean, forgive me. More questions? Franco, what's on your mind? You're muted.
There, I guess I have a voice now, huh?
Yeah, now you have a voice.
I've just been watching it, and it is all interesting, and I don't doubt that. Well, I'm not sure that Putin cares that much about the monuments. I'm sure he would like them, but,
Yeah.
you know, but I think he's a megalomaniac enough to decide if he can't have it, then whatever it takes to get the rest of it is worth doing. So I don't trust him a bit.
Yeah, I fear to agree with you. There are rumors that he wouldn't hesitate to use a nuke on anything, and I'm hoping those stay rumors. Whether, again, I think he probably deeply wants not to hurt the ancient monuments. But I think I might agree with you that if it comes to it, he'll wipe them out. And part of my thinking there is that, as I've tried to show, Kyiv and Russia have long experience with demolishing important buildings and then rebuilding them again when they change their minds. So if worse comes to worse, I hope that's what's going to happen, but none of us knows. Yeah. Other thoughts?
I
Donna, hi, Donna.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say thank you. This was just really insightful for me. What I took away from it is how you brought all of these things together. Having traveled to Istanbul with you and
Yes.
listened to your lectures many, many years ago, and having gone to Moscow not too many years ago, we went on a delegation with our sister city, and we spent a couple of weeks in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and our sister city, Rostov. And having seen these things, gone to the museum, seen these buildings and everything, I haven't been to Ukraine, but I just find this fascinating. And you really brought a lot of it together for me. So thank you so much for this lecture. I just find it really, really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, and thanks for reminding me that we were in Istanbul together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll put in a touristic note. If this awful war ceases, please, and they can get it all cleaned up, Kyiv really is one of Europe's loveliest cities, as well as one of its most historic and interesting. It's vastly green. The monuments are spectacular, and they're very, very proud of what they have. It's very much worth a visit. And it's not the only city in Ukraine that you could say that about. It's very rich archaeologically, architecturally, and all those other good things. It's worth a visit.
Cool.
Other ideas? Yes, sir, Mr. Zoom user. Oh, you're waving your finger. Oh, okay, not waving the finger. Anybody else?
Yes, I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
Stephen Pommier, yes.
Stephen, yes.
My concern, I really enjoyed your talk, and it's wonderful to be able to appreciate the culture that we all spring from in many ways. Every culture influences every other one, and it's really wonderful to know the culture through someone who studied it like you have, and I very much appreciate that. One thing that I'm very concerned about is the war culture that is descended upon us, and we talk about the head of the Russian state in a way that it's not dignified for us. We may think he's a bad person, or we may think what he's doing is bad, and it may be, but to go overboard and to make people evil, as we've done to ourselves. We talk about the different peoples that people our own nation in this way. We have it's difficult for us. We're learning, and I hope we learn very much more quickly that it's wrong to dehumanize people in any way, no matter what the conditions. And the other part of it is that we lionize the other side, our side, so to speak. We absolve the Ukrainians of any wrongdoing, and maybe that's true, but I think not. And I think that the history is one, and you've brought that up to some degree, that different peoples have struggled with these issues. But we, I hope, have become more humane and recognize that violent alternatives are not good things, and that we need to answer them with nonviolence as opposed to more violence. We want to turn down the heat as opposed to turning it up. And one of the ways of doing that is appreciating the cultural importance of places like this. And I think you do a yeoman service in that regard, and I thank you again.
Thank you so much. And I certainly agree. And one of the things that's bothering me is this week-long phenomenon of canceling Russian culture and, firing conductors and all that stuff. Ouch, ouch, ouch. I would like to blame, put the blame squarely on Mr. Putin and his vile little cabal of oligarchs. and I cringe at the anti-Russian stuff because I should have mentioned earlier, I'm also, when I was in college, I was a Russian studies minor. So, you know, I'm tugged all sorts of different ways here, but you're absolutely right. We got to remember that we're talking about humans, not painting too broad a brush.
And we ourselves have some responsibility here. We have not been people who have never invaded any place. And we are not ones to be making judgments here as we are. We can certainly make a judgment, but not the way we're doing it. Taking the lead, it's inappropriate.
Thank you. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? Going, okay, then. I'm going to bring this to a halt then. Thank you so much for your attention and your comments. I value them, and thank you for letting me get a lot of this stuff off my chest. And let's just keep our fingers crossed. Anything else? Nope, I'm supposed to say something or other else, but I don't remember what, so good night.